It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our panel tonight titled Stolen Children, Stolen Lands, Exploring the Forgotten History of American Indian Boarding Schools. The Middleton Center acknowledges that it is located on the ancestral lands of Osage, Missouri, Sac and Fox, Iowa, Kickapoo, Omaha, Ponca, and Kansas peoples, and that this community is the beneficiary. The recent discoveries of unmarked graves at government-run schools for Indigenous children in Canada surface like a long forgotten nightmare. But for many Native American and First Nations people in Canada and the United States, the nightmare was never forgotten. Instead, the discoveries are a reminder of how many living Native Americans were products of an experiment in forcibly removing children from their families and culture. In the last 2 years, Canada and several US states have begun to recognize their histories with Native American boarding schools, institutions that set out to assimilate Native American children into westernized US ways of life by stripping them of Indigenous tradition and culture. To discuss some of these issues are our speakers tonight. Ikutsi Miskimaki Ikubek is Blackfeet Red River Metis, German American and an enrolled member of the Little Shell Chippewa. Iku is the currently community engagement coordinator at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Iku grew up in Missoula, Montana, the settler-occupied homelands of the Bitterroot Salish, and spent much of their life on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. They graduated from Harvard with an honors degree in social studies, writing their senior thesis, "The Black Robes Must Be to Them in the Place of Their Wise Woman," on the forced reformation of gender and Blackfeet cosmology at the Holy Family Mission boarding school on the Blackfeet Reservation. They are a descendant of many boarding school survivors who attended Holy Family Mission, St. Peter's, Fort Shaw Industrial School, St. Ignatius Mission, Paul in Montana, and Chimmewa Indian School, Oregon, during the assimilative period. Our second speaker, Mark Palmer, is professor and chair in the Department of Geography here at Mizzou. He is also a member of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma. Professor Palmer's current research describes the processes of translating Indigenous knowledge into standardized 3D image and visualization technologies. The investigators of this project have the rare opportunity to collaborate with Otomi timekeepers and knowledge holders. This study provides an opportunity to learn more about the construction and mobility of Indigenous technoscience processes and what impacts visualization technologies might have upon Otomi calendar knowledge and vice versa. And our third speaker, Melissa Horner, is a citizen of the Manitoba Metis Federation and is a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. She is a fourth-year PhD student in sociology at the University of Missouri. Melissa's research interests cohere around exploring how Native peoples navigate and heal the effects of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma caused by past and ongoing settler colonialism. She pursues her research and doctoral degree as a health policy research scholar for the Robert Wood Johnson College. Please welcome you.
Oki Misunitani Kuikutsimi Skimaki Bek. I'm Iku. I'm just going to provide us with a quick overview of boarding school, US boarding school history before we get into the conversation, just so people kind of understand the basics. So setting the context on Indian boarding schools in the United States, some of you may recognize the photo that was previously up there and is also in the background of this. That is a picture of Indian children at Carlisle, which is currently considered the first Indian boarding school that was in the United States. So of course, there's the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny. This image / GIF or GIF, if that's how you say it, shows land loss of Native Americans. And so as you can see, I mean, as you may know, Missouri, for example, there are no reservations in Missouri. There are a lot of states on the East Coast that no longer have any native land holdings. And so This is something that was happening at the same time and in concert with the federal government's boarding school policies. This is a bit of a timeline that is much too long for us to get fully into, but as you can see, in the 1879 is when the first Indian boarding school opened, and then in the 1960s and 80s is when the federal policy on Indian boarding schools started to change. There were three main federal policies that allowed for the Indian boarding schools to occur and formatted them in the United States, and that's the Indian Civilization Fund Act of March 3rd, 1819. So that provided funding for missionaries to educate Indians. So they had grants, and it was actually the missionaries who came to the federal government and asked, can we have a fund that we can specifically go out and civilize Indians? And so the point of that in the language is to make Native people into Christian people. Then there was the creation of the BIA within the Department of War, and that was primarily to administer the monies from the Civilization Fund. And so that was also to have Indian agents involved, which were more of a policing unit in the process of getting people to boarding schools. And then there is Grant's peace policy, which really shouldn't be considered a peace policy, but that was meant to replace the corrupt Indian agents with Christian missionaries, so missionary, agent, missionary, and the federal government used these policies to establish boarding schools. So 1879 is when Carlisle was created, and the federal government recently released a report stating that they had 408 federally funded Indian boarding schools. So the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition actually contributed to that research through a memorandum of understanding, and have been doing our own independent research. And so in addition to the 408 government funded ones, there were 101 that were funded just by churches or private individuals. So there were 509 US Indian boarding schools that we currently have on our list. In addition to that, there were thousands of day schools, which served the same purpose, but did not remove people from their homes, and sanatoriums. There were also orphanages, all which serve similar purposes. And we're going to eventually expand our list to cover the orphanages and the sanatoriums, because there were specific ones made for Indian children. And so Indian children were forcibly abducted or coerced into going to Indian boarding schools. School was mandatory, and many Indian communities did not have schools, so people would be taken to these boarding schools. Many were sent hundreds of miles away. Some stayed in their communities, depending on where the boarding school was. They were stripped of their clothes, their hair was cut. They're often given a number rather than a name. So one of the things that I do on a daily basis is I work with living survivors of boarding schools. And many of them still identify with their number and will come to us and say, I'm number 77 or something like that. And that's how they introduce themselves. And many were neglected, malnourished, beaten, starved, or abused. This, of course, is the image of children after they've had their clothing changed, their hair cut. There was recently, which some of you may have seen the news about, but there was recently release of information out of Harvard that they were actually collecting some of the hair from Indian boarding schools for DNA research. And so Harvard has the hair from 700 Indian boarding school students right now that they've recently just announced that they have in their collection. And there's thousands throughout the country that came from the hair that was removed from these children. So by 1926, it was estimated that 83% of school-age Native children were in boarding schools. This is from Education for Extinction by Adams Wallace. All of these facts are, and I highly recommend that book. So by 1920, 20,000 children were reported as attending, but it should be noted that these records were not actually centralized anywhere. So these are just the ones that they were able to count. There's more people than that. By 1925, 60,000. In Canada, there were much less residential schools, but because they did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they were able to actually calculate how many children there were, and they had 150,000 children. And so we assume that there is a similar number who attended in the US. This is an image from one of those schools. General Richard Henry Pratt was the person who came up with the Kill the Indian, Save the Man. This was the general philosophy of Indian boarding schools that was taken across the country to all of the boarding schools that were established after that. Recently, the Department of the Interior released its first report on basically what the Indian boarding schools did. And so the US government has also stated that the policy was specifically designed to dispossess Native nations of land, to assimilate Native nations through schooling, to target and remove Indigenous children, to disrupt Indian families and tribes, and that further review is required. We can get into this a little bit more later. That's the basic overview. We also have some of the experiences of boarding school survivors featured here that we can get into at some point. I would trigger warning on these because there was a lot of sexual abuse in these schools. And so that's what many people still speak to today. And then this last image, the image that I had at the beginning, the one on the right is just a painting by a Canadian Indigenous artist, and it's a representation of kind of the return of our culture. So that's the basics of the overview. And we could also talk about what our connections are to boarding schools themselves. And I'll let you go, Nestor.
Yeah, for sure. Kanshi Kakiao Nizami Miwiten Alakshman. Unless additional question. So that's the Michif language. That's what Métis people speak. I have two tribal lineages. One is Métis and the other is Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. They also speak Michif as well as Anishinaabe. And I suppose what I just said in Michif is kind of a good entry point to my connection to boarding schools. I don't have any super recent relatives that went, but there was a whole cluster of relatives that went in my great grandmother's generation and the great grandparents' generation. So that's aunties, uncles, a sort of whole slew of them around 1910 to 1920. And so that was the moment in my own family that the Michif language was lost due to boarding school attendance. I have an uncle who lives on the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and he tells a story about his father, who's one of my great uncles. And he went to Fort Totten boarding school, which is in North Dakota. And he tells the story as this relative of mine who went to Fort Totten. He showed up at the school not being able to speak English. He spoke Michif as well as Anishinaabe. And so when he got there, he only knew one word in English, and it was yes. That was the only word that he knew. And so that was the only card he had to play. If asked anything, if trying to be in conversation with any of the instructors of the school. And so there was a broken window one day in the school, and one of the instructors approached my uncle and asked him if he broke the window. And since he spoke Michif, our family's indigenous language, he replied yes in English, and he was severely beaten as a result of his response. And so as a child, that was, doesn't need to be said, that's obviously a traumatic experience for him. And he stopped speaking Michif best he could after that, and did not pass down that language to any of his children. And the same sort of thing, that was just one experience, of course, but if you can imagine experiences like that happening across the family, the language didn't get through. And so that is a connection in my family to the school experience.
Yeah, so she's right about the boarding school being the number one catalyst for destroying native language. It's absolutely, it's undeniable in many different ways. Of course, as she was talking about, was the punishment aspect amongst the generation of the 1910s, 1920s. And then they became parents of children that they discouraged from speaking in the household. And it was subtle. In some cases, children were trying to speak the language, Kiowa language is what I'm talking about here. And they would be reprimanded by the mother or the grandparent saying, don't speak the language unless you speak it right? As if there's a absolute way of speaking. And at the time, the children had already integrated. There's lots of encountering and exchanges that had gone on at the time. And so I would imagine that the language the younger children were speaking was kind of a hybrid mix. Even the dialects were probably more English based than Kiowa. And I heard this from 6 people in the community that talked about this with my dad. Now, my father grew up with his grandparents, and so they spoke fluently in the household, and he picked that up. And the only way he picked that up was because of that. His brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles, have limited fluency in terms of the language. So it was the opportunity that he gained from my great-grandparents that put him in a position to be able to speak the language and speak it with confidence. They didn't go to boarding school. They weren't a part of the boarding school system. And so the language slipped through the cracks of the iron cage and was allowed to flourish. Nowadays, with parents that are my age and maybe a little bit younger than me, are in the process of revitalizing in places like Norman, Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Dallas, a lot of places. And they're doing it in their own way, and they have to, because all they have is practice. All indigenous knowledge is all indigenous knowledge. There's not a complete set of that everywhere in the world, although in the literature, we always use that as if it's a complete set. It's fragments. It's fragments that you have to put together. And so these parents are trying to recover what was destroyed early on. And they often want my dad to come and work with them. And Dad will help them, but he wants them to recover the language on their own terms. Not look at an elder and say, is that the right way to speak, Larry? Is that the right way? You speak it your way. There's no one in here that speaks English the way they did in 1875, right? And we've gained so many words in our lexicon since 1875. So if you can imagine trying to use 1875 terminology and ideas in a classroom if you're an academic, you would totally fall on your face. Those kids would have you wiped out because their lexicon is much more complex. Right? So that was a good point. I'll have other stories to tell.
That connects well actually to part of my story, which is my mom is from that generation of parents that wanted to teach their children the language. So here I have some photos. Of course, one of them is cropped off. So on the left is Holy Family Mission, and I'm on the left bottom corner. The person in the middle is my great grandmother, Annie Maxim Walls. She attended Holy Family Mission. She met my great grandfather there. My grandma, who is still living, she's in the upper right-hand corner, Angeline Wall, Inspec. She attended St. Ignatius boarding school in Chemawa. She never went to any school except for boarding schools until she was later in college. I wasn't not sharing with some people I know. I'm sure. No worries. It's sorry if you do it. Sure. But I'll figure it out over time. So my great grandmother named me soon after I was born, and basically everyone in my family gets Indian names. There's a specific way in which they're transferred in Blackfeet tradition, which would be extremely long to explain. But my mom decided that me and my sister had to go by our Indian names. We weren't going to go by English names. Everyone else in our family go by your English name. You say my Indian name is. And she decided that people needed to start speaking Blackfeet if they were going to live on Blackfeet land, and so they needed to start speaking our names. And she worked for the Blackfeet Language Immersion School for most of our lives. But my grandma was born speaking the language. And actually, so I'm from a Plains tribe, so our contact with Europeans was way later. So when my grandma was growing up, in the summers, she lived in a teepee. And during the school year, she went to boarding school. So complete opposite existence, right? Existence. But she does not speak English anymore. My great grandma spoke the language, but she only, like you said, only spoke it with closed doors because she thought if other people hear the language, they're going to speak it, then they're going to get in trouble. When I was growing up, one of the things that you'll hear as a very common theme, and I don't know why they use lye, but they use lye soap a lot in these boarding schools. They would have people put soap in their mouth when they spoke, and so my grandma always had soap in her mouth. And so when I was a kid, I always knew about these kids that she would talk about who died from the soap poisoning, who were members of our tribe. But then she also, I mean, it's complicated because she also, you know, that was the only life that she knew, and she ended up working at boarding school after she attended. And yeah, it became complicated, but my name is the name of her mother, who was the first generation of our family to go to boarding school. So her name was Maki, and then she was renamed Minnie, and she was never called Maki again. So that's why my name was kind of spoken into existence again, was for that reason. Yeah, so that's a language connection. You can see if I have the ability to do this. So for the Zoom people, now you can see the photos. This Holy Family mission is shut down now. Overall, there are 112 schools that are still open. Some board, some do not. In the 1970s, a lot of those schools were handed over to the tribes, so many of them do the opposite. And then there are still Indian boarding schools that are run by churches as well.
Originally, the Kairos Quakers came. They were the ones who came into the community. And they often would report to government agencies, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time, that the Kiowas did not want to farm. They weren't going to farm. And so we need to think of alternatives. They like to ranch. They like to raise horses. And so that was kind of a trade-off early on. But for the government agents, that wasn't a strong enough response. The Quakers were too passive. And so soon, Baptist missionaries, Methodist missionaries, and Catholic missionaries came into unity. There was a Catholic boarding school. There was a Rainy Mountain boarding school. Now, I don't know what the religious affiliation was with Rainy Mountain, but St. Patrick's was Catholic school in Anadarko, Oklahoma. It would be an interesting question to look at the various religious denominations at boarding schools and what was the predominant boarding school experience. In a place like Oklahoma, it's going to be more Protestant, not so much Catholic. There were two Catholics, me and someone else before we moved to Missouri. But that would be an interesting thing to look at, is look at the different denominations. And then for historians to dig in to look at how these denominations approached boarding school. One of the missionaries, Isabel Crawford, was from St. Louis, and she was beloved by Caiaphas. She was beloved by them. And before she died, she moved back to St. Louis, but requested that she be buried back in Oklahoma at Saddle Mountain Cemetery. So that's an interesting story, and it kind of shows the complexity of these relationships between the people who are associated with boarding schools, this whole civilizing mission, and the tribal communities.
Yeah, Oklahoma had the largest number of boarding schools. I think the number that we have right now is 94. And that's in part, which if people know some of the general history of Indian removal, because there are so many tribes in Oklahoma. But many people in the boarding school schooling world consider it one of the ground zeros of boarding schools because of the length of time that boarding schools were there and the overall impact.
A good connection too with that is, Iko just mentioned like the removal era in sort of federal Indian policy. And a good way to think about boarding schools too is that I know we're talking about sort of the history of boarding schools, and Iko and Mark both mentioned connection to present, but it's also just important to take in sort of the broader scope of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism, like we live in a settler colonial nation, and it's active and ongoing. And boarding schools are a slice of that. And so, for example, settler colonialism has always been trying to get rid of Indigenous people on this continent, erasing our knowledges, physically genociding us, culturally genociding us through assimilation, things like this. And so prior to the boarding school era in around 1880, as Iku shared, you had things like, centuries, literal centuries of physical genocide that was happening on Native nations. And then after that comes removal era, 1830, a bunch of tribes were removed from the east to west of the Mississippi. 1851, you get the Indian Appropriations Act, which physically, spatially moves people again onto reservations. Then you start moving into boarding school era around 1880. You get the allotment era in 1887, which then starts attacking political sovereignty. They basically start being like, all right, this communal way that Native nations govern is not going to work to assimilate people. So let's start chopping up Native lands and making it so that people can be incentivized to be individual landowners. Again, assimilation, assimilation, assimilation. Boarding school era happens. Sometime after that, you get things like in the 1950s, the Voluntary Relocation Act, which again is attacking a sort of political cultural concentration of Native people and incentivizing them to move into urban sectors. Dylan Meyer was the architect of that act. He's also the person that invented Japanese internment camps. And so you can kind of understand the sort of ideology that was running both of these types of things that were happening in this country. And then fast forward, you get things like the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in the 1970s, and it's currently under attack today, which is this act was designed to sort of counter the discovery that 1/3 of all Native children were being removed from Native homes and being adopted by non-Native families. And so boarding schools, sort of the peak of those ended, but then Native children started being adopted out. And so I sort of chronicle this to show that settler colonialism has been a really brilliantly designed system to get rid of Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous people, political sovereignty and power that we have always inherently had. And so it's important to just keep boarding schools in mind of this sort of larger scope of things, both historically and in this ongoing way that Native nations and Indigenous peoples are still contending with today.
Yeah, we often say that the arc, just like was mentioned, the arc of like Indian child welfare policy, as the boarding schools started to become more and more tribally controlled, there was an Indian adoption project, which I used to have slides on about it, because actually our New director of healing is Sandy Whitehawk, who is an adoptee who's done a lot of work around Native adoptees returning to their communities. And so we always try to have that as part of the conversation, but there was a lot of, it was very incentivized for non-Native people to adopt Native children. And they were even, I mean, there's documents showing that there were prices that people could pay, and they were cheaper than other children. Yeah, I mean, it's an important thing to note that essentially these children were used as experiments in a lot of ways for the settling of this country. And even, I mean, it's something that is important to note for university too, is the fact that these students were used as research subjects. Anthropologists went to these boarding schools to gather information about plant knowledge. Like a lot of the plant knowledge in Montana comes from children who went to Indian boarding schools, and then it was formalized by an anthropologist who went and collected that information. Hair DNA. Let's see what else. They used to have children produce traditional designs of their tribe, and then they would have. So we've got some archives that are just like these designs that children drew, and then they made sure that those children don't know what those designs are anymore, right? But they catalog them way. And I mean, of course, medical experimentation. One of our board members is someone who experienced sterilization, which isn't talked about a lot, but was the legal policy and was often used throughout the boarding school era. Yeah, and is significant, and it doesn't even fully cover the entire issue, because it requires all of the children to be enrolled in federally recognized tribes. And sometimes children aren't enrolled in those tribes, but they're still Native and still wanted by their community members. We had a case in Montana when I was younger. Little Shell Tribe, which I'm a member of, was originally state recognized and became federally recognized later. But while it was state recognized, there was a situation where there was a child that there were multiple people in their family that wanted them, but they ended up getting adopted out of the community because it was not a federally recognized tribe, it was just state recognized. So there's still limitations to ICWA, and of course they're also trying to completely do away with the Indian Child Welfare Act. But before that, if you were adopted out, it was very difficult to find out who your family was or what.
Just a side note, if anybody's interested, the Supreme Court just heard the oral arguments for Holland v. Brackeen, and so that's where ICWA is at stake. So anybody who's interested in learning more about that.
When are any of us removed that system? So initially, yes, we see the American Indian relocation. Okay, so relocation is a big thing. Move it from one area to another. In some cases, people say that Indians climate change, because if you lived in Georgia and you moved to Oklahoma, the climate, the environmental conditions are so different that you experience climate change. Another thing, relocating your children. So as a parent of a child, there's nothing more dear to you, right? And so to conquer a society, you take their children, right? Or you take their future. And then a third aspect of that is their culture. Lifestyle. It's completely changed. Today, we were talking in class about Dan Wildcat's Red Alert. And he brilliantly puts that thesis together for the students and the reader, saying that all of these things that happen, and because of climate change, you're implicated. You are a part of the system. Relocation, what does that mean? Well, Las Vegas is running out of water. California is running out of water. You know who has the most water in the United States? You're sitting on it. Missouri. Yep. They're coming. Your life, or your children's life, or your grandchildren's lives are going to change, because they're going to bring their culture. They're going to bring their ideas. So Missouri, as you know it now, in 50 years, will totally change. Your children, what's the future of your children? You think, right? What's their future going to be? Is it going to be, are they going to be better off than you somehow? Is the environment going to be better than you have it? Well, there's another connection to indigenous people. And then the third, your lifestyles, again, will change because of this. Or they won't. And you will encounter a sort of genocide if you don't change. Potentially, you will die off because the environment is shifting. If the environment's shifting, climate is changing, potentially you have to adapt. So we're not, even though we're talking about American Indian experiences, we're all in the system. We're all a part of this integrated, and Wildcat calls this indigenous realism. There's no idealism whatsoever about it. Man, when you look at the parts per billion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's not a lie. That's proof that things are happening. So when these encounters happen with American Indians, they said, how are we going to deal with these people? They want land. But is it the people? Is it the Euro-American people? Or is it the system that was run with people? The capitalist system, the extraction of resources, that type of system. Well, we're still in it. There's nothing different about it. It's still here. We didn't change it. We didn't look at people and say, this system had an adverse effect on these people. Maybe this is deleterious to all of us. No, we wrote it out. Here we are. So Wildcat's book is an excellent commentary on how we're all part of this boarding school, that removals, loss of lifestyle in your children's future, which was normally thought was just contingent, is everything. It's going to take him tangent, Larry. You know, when it comes to boarding schools,
It's all related.
yeah. So it's like a cycle, right? It's cyclical. You never come out of it. We like to think that things are linear and straight, going to bigger and better places.
Well, as Melissa said, settler colonial is still the system. That, at least that's a big part of it still.
When you remove people from their land, including putting them in boarding schools, you're removing them from the way that they ecologically cared for the land around them. Like the Blackfeet we do a lot of fire ecology. That's why we're called Blackfeet, because our feet were black from the soot of fire. So that was one thing that also impacted change, right? Is that when you remove the people from the land who actually understand it, who cultivated it, because this wasn't some like untouched wilderness. We cultivated these landscapes. Then it's going to have a major impact, which you see at least in winter and AC with fires, wildfires. They're ridiculous. That didn't used to be a thing. So it also accelerated that the removal of people.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, to your point, I feel like it's a really valuable one, that it could so easily be framed as this is our problem. Like our relatives got put in boarding schools, and this is an Indian problem. This is a Native nation problem, and it is to some extent. Hopefully, sometimes when we can get into some of the like effects of this on our nations and communities and families themselves. But what Mark was saying about the thing that happened with cultural genocide is that Native nations had all these ways of being in the world, all these epistemologies and ontologies, ways of understanding things, ways of knowing things that the settler colonial system got rid of. And we knew how to be in different relationships, in different kinds of reciprocity, in all these different ways that are so far exceed ideas of property and ownership and all of these things that really drive our society today, that, like, again, as Dr. Palmer said, it was a bad mistake, because now settler colonial systems have erased all of that knowledge, or really, really tried to. it still exists in some communities, it still exists in some elders, it still exists in different kinds of ways, but it is fractured. It got damaged along the way. And so people are working very, very hard in Indigenous communities to revitalize and make sure there's a resurgence of these ways that we have always already known that settler colonialism intervened in. And it very, very well could save the world, quite literally, if Indigenous people lead with these kinds of knowledges that predate colonialism, predate imperialism, things of that nature.
But I think for the reclamation of that knowledge, which actually brings me into the bill, the federal bill that we have right now, there needs to be an investment from the federal government, equal investment from the federal government in revitalization of our cultures and our languages specifically, because they funded so much, they completely funded our language loss. So we have a bill. So the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition was created because there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that came about because victims of the boarding schools sued the federal government there and the churches. And as part of a class action lawsuit settlement, they created a Truth Commission. In the US, we're trying to get one via a federal bill because we just haven't gone through the legalities yet of suing the federal government. And so it was originally introduced by Deb Haaland back when she was in Congress. Once she became head of the Department of the Interior, she's been able to help us by creating the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, which did a year-long report on the federal government's involvement in Indian boarding schools. And we're pushing for there to be a Truth and Healing Commission that learns from the mistakes of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada to exist in the United States. The bill is supposed to both cover federal Indian boarding schools and church-run Indian boarding schools. There have already been a couple of hearings. I often show this video, which I won't show just because it's technologically difficult for me to show videos. But actually someone who attended Fort Totten spoke to the House about their experiences, and a few other boarding school survivors spoke about their experiences. You will cry if you watch it, you will, and it will probably disturb you for a while. So the House has had a hearing, the Senate has had a hearing. We have until the end of the year to pass it, and we're gonna reintroduce it again next year, most likely. And continue to work on that. But we have been able to educate a bunch of lawmakers on it. We're just trying to get the federal government to hold, or we are trying to hold the federal government accountable, and especially get resources back into Indian country because they funded and put so many of the resources into destroying our communities and our languages specifically. That's one of the things that's happening right now in the world of fighting that is passing that policy. There's policies that are being passed at the state level around curriculum, especially, and teaching people about the Indian boarding school history. I was lucky enough, I grew up in Montana and went to public schools, and we had the Indian Ed for All Act. That's part of our state constitution. So I actually did learn about boarding schools, but most people don't ever, unless they have family experience with it.
Well, there are students in here, and there are students who are online. What is the message of hope? What's hope? We know this information. I think this legislation you bring it home is hopeful. What do you think, Melissa? What message of hope you know?
It's a great question. I mean, I teach a class here at Mizzou called Settler Colonialism and Native Nations. And one of my students is back there. Hi, Charlotte. And I taught this class 3 times, and this class gives me so much hope. My students gobble up all of the information in that class. At first, they're angry. They're like, what has happened here? Why didn't anybody tell us this in their K-12 public education? Like, they're upset about it. And we create space for that. I mean, the same thing happened to me when I didn't know any of this stuff. I'm a Métis and Anishinaabe person, and I didn't learn this stuff in school either. It wasn't until I got access to higher ed and got an undergrad degree and came across a Native Studies program at Montana State University. And I felt the same. I was like, what happens to my family? Like, it's confusing and it's hard to understand. And then after we go through that process, it lights fires. My students have literal like fires igniting. I can feel it in our class. I can feel it in our discussions. I can feel it in the conversations and the questions of like, all right, let me ask more. Let's go deeper so I can really understand this. And I can go out into the world and do the things that I'm going to do, but with this knowledge, with these people in mind. And since I'm in a sociology department, we talk a lot about the intersections between individual agency and responsibility and systems and how we move between them and how it has to be both and everything all the time in order for any of this to work, in order to have any hope about anything. I think the most poignant thing too that came up in my class last semester was I had a student, sociology major, and he said something along the lines of, I feel like settler colonialism doesn't want us to have hope. It wants us to feel like so tired and so hurt and so frustrated by everything that's going on, by capitalism, by white supremacy, just by all of the storm that's going on, that he's like, but I feel like that's what it wants me to do, is feel hopeless. He's like, I feel like I'm going to double down on it. And I'm going to double down on, like, I'm going to keep going, because that is the last thing that this really intricate, durable system wants me to have. And he's like, they can't take that away from me. And so I feel like that's part of the message, is like, now we have to keep going. I don't know. I mean, what's the alternative?
Alternatives.
Yeah.
I think so because this is such sad work and I do it every day, I force myself to look for like little nuggets of hope every single day. I think that there's an amazing language revitalization movement throughout this country. There are language immersion schools throughout this country. And there are a lot of people who are really dedicated to bringing the languages back, a lot of youth. I think that like the greatest hope, especially in the movement of boarding school healing specifically, of course, the movement of cultural, like healing from cultural genocide is also in many ways led by the youth, but the Indigenous youth have this, I kind of explain it in my own life as like, you're removed enough from that direct boarding school trauma that you have the ability to speak about it and to be there for your elders. So we see a lot of Indigenous youth taking initiative. The return of children's bodies from Carlisle, that was done by Native youth. There was the Sishangu Youth Council. They were like all under 20 years old, and they went to Carlisle and they figured out the legalities and they got 6 children's bodies returned to their reservation. Pine Ridge also has a really incredible Indigenous Youth Council that just went to Massachusetts and got items from, I think, Wounded People. Anyways, got some of their ancestral items back in this like caravan. And these youth also, I mean, I would consider myself to be young-ish too, but we are very concerned about the elders in our lives. And so I see youth connecting to elders and taking care of them during this time. You know, I do oral interviews of survivors on their experiences, and it has, it's not been even once, it's been almost every single time that the elders have come to me with the youth in their family. So with their granddaughter, with their son, with their, and that's the person that's bringing them there so that they can have their meal. So I think that there's really a lot of hope in the generations that are ready to take on the step of healing and know that there's something that we can do for our people that will change the future. And I think that anytime that I see like a Native in regalia dancing around, I also get hope, but I also kind of cry, but that's just, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of amazing. Yeah, it really, there's something about it to be part of a lineage of people who, like, genocide tried to happen. Like, I should not be here for all intents and purposes, here at this university, here on this earth. And there's something really profound about it when, like, you see, like, all these Native people still existing, like sitting up here with you, like, just all the things, because it wasn't supposed to happen that way. Like, in some ways, the federal government, like, failed, like, utterly, because we're here and we're talking about it. And that's really important. And to your point, it's like, I so often, the whole reason I'm getting a PhD is because of my grandma. Like, my grandma, she didn't go to boarding school, but because her immediate relatives went to boarding schools, they kept her out of any school. And so my grandma couldn't read or write because schools were dangerous. They were like, okay, you can't go to any school, like, none of you, because that, it's a bad place for Indians. And so my grandma was illiterate by Western standards, but she did so many other things in her life. She had such a hard life. My grandma was very sad my whole life. And I learned so much from her still. Same thing with my mom. Like, a lot of some of the stuff that Iku has mentioned is like, this has produced intergenerational trauma. So even though I'm removed from some of the traumas that we're talking about, like boarding schools, for instance, it still affected the immediate members of my family. And so they had behaviors, coping mechanisms that then infiltrated into my house and my life. And so all of that is sort of a long way to say that I find myself in a sociology PhD program because I finally found an entry point to learn, to try to heal, to navigate, like, what's happened in my family, what's happened in my tribes, what's happened that is a shared experience of a lot of people indigenous to this place. And so I always, like, keep them in mind, like, while I'm here. Like, my grandma's somebody that I always think about. Like, I looked at her photo before I came here. That's like, all right, grandma, like, we're going to talk about it tonight, and it's a real privilege to have, like, a little bit of distance from it, because now, like, movement can happen, like, in my generation being, yeah.
Thank you so much for giving us so many things. We'll open it up for questions, and Kate there will take the questions that are coming via Zoom, and I will take questions from here. So let's open it up.
So, thank you, the discussion. You mentioned possibility of reinvestment by the federal government in correcting some of these things, civil liability, refugee lawsuit, but you didn't mention the word reparation. And that's been part of the conversation.
So, if we want to get our bill passed, we can't use that word. That's basically it, right?
Yep.
But yes, yeah, we do. I think that should be a one. Yeah, but it's just it's very difficult to legally get anything passed that has the words reparations in it. I mean, we didn't even have the word reparations when the Republicans were pushing back saying, will this leave room for reparations? Like, define that word. But yes, I do believe that. I believe that Black people and Indigenous people and probably other people of color deserve.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good.
So this is, first of all, thinking about in the context of reparations, reconciliation. What is it about American white supremacy is so recalcitrant to any of these things? Right? Whereas other communities have been able to heal, or at least attempt to heal, or at least attempt to reflect upon the reality. What is it about American white supremacy that's so resistant to And I mean, it's really wild. It's pretty clear that we're unlike so many other places.
Truth is a political word. That was also something we talked about with our bill, because adding truth into it is taking a political stance today. So.
Patriarchal property owning, resource consuming, I mean, there's a number of just built-in values that we cannot break from easily. And it's, you track that history that is still play. I stood quite sprints in defending this idealized power consuming being.
The things too that I talk about with my students in my class is fear. It's very hard to let go of a whole way of knowing and being and doing if there is no imaginable alternative. And so people are scared, like, because if we as a country, if we as individuals on any level sort of let go a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to get really uncomfortable and I'm going to sit in this really uncertain spot that, like, I don't know what's going to happen next. And there isn't infrastructure or a direction to go next for a more livable future. That can be really, really scary. And so I think that like emotional experience is part of it too. And we know that there's not a lot of space for talk of emotion either in any of this. That's part of like another mechanism, like the logic of colonialism and all this stuff is like, people can't feel things if we're trying to like do capitalism and do superiority and do all of these things. So yeah.
And what would it be to be American if they told the truth about, or if we told the truth about history, right? I think that that's one of the destabilizing, or like the things that would really destabilize people. It's like, but I'm also not a studier of civil state.
It's just like quickly informing that it's happening around the world.
Yeah.
Europe is not different than what we're seeing here. Like the relations in Brazil between Bolsonaro and the Venezuela is about the same division, just handled by the middle, and the same rhetoric and the same incapacity to speak or find a common speech. With very globalized. It's not just necessarily the United States.
And also, if I just could, add to that, I mean, it's the current geopolitics that, I mean, the economic dominance of the geopolitical dominance of US, though it's being shaken. I mean, that also is connected to the fact that how much you want to, invest in talking about different kinds of truth. So I think that is also something that needs to be kept, We wanted to ask.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think maybe one route into answering Dr. Wilson's question is the fact that recognizing obviously that settler colonialism is a global phenomenon. And for our panelists, I would just be curious to know if you looked into your work at broader resonances and other contexts, thinking in particular of Australia. Sure. That would be the obvious one, but these kinds of dynamics, they're also prevalent within Europe itself against other Europeans too, in the 20th century. If you guys speak to that, maybe that could get us closer to the answer. Danny's question: if there is something peculiarly American about this, the frustrating answer would be yes and no, I think. And I recognize it's not just an American thing. Damn, we're good at it. Yes.
But that would be my question. You guys sort of, what is your take on kind of the parallels with these similar dynamics of cultural genocide in other settler colonial contexts around the world, other than just the United States, particularly Australia, but not exclusively?
I found it to, basically anytime that I meet another Indigenous person, someone who identifies as Indigenous to another area, that they've experienced very similar. We even like our neighbors in Minneapolis are a barber shop, and there are people there from Ethiopia who experience the same thing with their Indigenous children, like boarding schools, kind of what you're talking about. And so I think that while I haven't studied it, it's very easy to connect those things once you meet other Indigenous people. It's an international struggle. And really all that our organization has looked at in detail is more of the places where they've gone through truth missions. So South Africa, Australia has had some sort of process. They have some really great research institutions there. There has been, I would have to go back into the Australia stuff to the specifics of the Aboriginal that they've done there. But I know they have more robust and funded healing Aboriginal program. So.
We would like to take a question from one of our Zoom viewers. Kate, would you just like to read the question?
Yes, thank you, Ariel, for asking this question. Apart from the Supreme Court decisions of fact, what can individuals do to support the spirit of ICWA? Are there groups or funds you recommend to support the safety of Native children? Question mark.
NIC, one of the National Indian Welfare Association, is an organization that does work defending ICWA. That's a good place for. They're legally the ones that are fighting it right now. So. What else is for the national?
I want to push it even further. My area of research is child welfare, and so I've been tracking this tightly. But something you said earlier that many of the reforms are initiated by young people, and young people are different. So tribes, child welfare is foster care, and that's really important. But to the person online, that question, besides land acknowledgements in our email, as a person who's not a member, understanding that it's important for these initiatives to be led by people of this identity. Besides writing a check, what can we do to be active?
Depends on what different identities you have. If you're a member of a church, please go research your church and find out if there are records that anyone has access to. One of the projects that we're doing is that we're creating a National Indian boarding school digital archive. So it's going to be a digital archive that eventually will have all of we're hoping we'll have all of the records from Indian boarding schools. They're not all located right now because they're not in a central location. And we've put in a number of FOIA requests and have not received the records. And so we're asking churches to provide records now too. So that's one of the things that people do is look for those records. They're also in private collections, like they're in random places. They're all over. Records for St. Ignatius, I found like in an Ursuline nunnery in one of their projects where they don't like go in there anymore, right? Like there's just like random places where these things are. If you run across something that's like related to a boarding school, reach out to an organization like NABS, because we will most likely want to archive it. And those are some of my suggestions. If you're not a church person, just like continuing to let people know about the issue is helpful. You guys can take that.
I think too, just something important is that since the sort of settler colonial assault on Native nations and Indigenous peoples was so multi-pronged, it attacked language, it attacked foodways, it attacked land, it attacked children. Like supporting any of those also supports all of the other things too. Like these nations and communities and families, all of these things have very interconnected relationships. And so there's very robust land back movements right now that are trying to return legal ownership and practical stewardship of indigenous homelands back to tribal nations or cooperatives, stuff like that. Things like that also support language revitalization because it plugs people back into the places where the languages were, descriptions that languages are trying to plug people back into cultural practices, which also then can be passed along to children. So there's like a domino effect of any number of entry points that can then help things that seem sort of detached, like the attack on Iqua for the moment. Anybody with social media, there is such, there's things like native Twitter, like Indian country is like very present on social media. And there's tons and tons of resources for like places you can give money to, since we still are in capitalism, places that you can support, places that you can go for nonviolent direct action, like ally support. There's all kinds of things that I can't remember off the top of my head at the moment, but there are tons of social media presences about like how people can lend themselves, whether it's their presence or their finances or their ideas or whatever too.
Lots of ecological environmental movements now that are being really led by indigenous groups.
Yeah.
Some very specific locations, but also some general knowledge too.
We'll take another question coming through Zoom.
Yes, I believe I'm pronouncing this. Amy asks, so is Indigenous entrepreneurship something that can be part of the resistance? There are times when I become frustrated with waiting for people to start accepting these realities. The community needs resources, but I am not sure what is the best way to go about providing for our community outside of policy advocacy or supporting Indigenous business owners.
I'm not fully sure I understand the question.
Is there a network for Indigenous entrepreneurs?
Yeah. You know, there's a group in New Zealand, and they are, I can't remember the name. They're primarily from South Island, Maori, from South Island. And they are really business. There's a couple of different academic groups in New Zealand. One is more, for the lack of a better term, dealing with traditional types of issues of language, indigenous methodologies, and so forth. Primarily, and I'm really generalizing, I don't really know what I'm talking about. From the North Island, okay, they're in Hamilton, they're in Auckland. Versus is more business oriented, which is South Island. And they have materials that people could go in. Maori are world global leaders in terms of indigenous. Let's put it that way. We often turn to Maori for ideas. In fact, the only time I've ever heard a child speak fluently to a parent in an indigenous language was in New Zealand. I've never heard but they have it going on. And they decided back in the 1970s, this is where we are going to start. We're going to start revitalizing. We're going to have Sesame Street-like programs in Maori. They just did it. And they haven't looked back. So they're leaders. So anybody that really wants to look at leadership, indigenous entrepreneurship and whatnot, should probably look them up, see what they have to say.
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, please. Sorry, Melissa.
Mine's short. My advice would just be the advice that I was given when I was younger and asked what I should do to contribute to my tribe, which is just that no matter what you do, whatever your passion is, we need more Native people doing it. So do it.
I was just going to say something too about as with everything, there's so many layers to this. It's like, again, since we're still in capitalism for the moment, it's like buy Native owned stuff. Like there was massive wealth transfers out of Indigenous hands into the hands of non-Native people. And so a lot of people in these communities are in an emergency. Like they are in an emergency not having their daily needs met. And so buying Native made products of anything. I mean, sort of what you just said, it's like pick something and Native people make it too or produce it too. So buying these things helps these communities, helps these families, while also all of the higher level things need to be happening too. That's not the end all be all, but that is something that is very practical that everybody can contribute to if they have the means to. So I think that's something that is tied a little bit to Indigenous like entrepreneurship, et cetera.
David here has a question.
Yeah, so thank you so much. This is fantastic. My question is, given the current educational tour and around the country, bringing up this issue, right, having America actually look at itself, right, engage with its history, and having the legislation being passed and people being documented. Are you concerned pushback is going to look like pushback against CRT? That there's going to be a pushback to say, no, 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 thank you very much. Don't want to hear it because it's divisive. It's making us feel bad. Don't want to do this. And that it's going to be being parallel this new movement that says, we don't hear anything that is upsetting or disquieting, discomforting. And you begin to get to that pushback, and you anticipate it becoming even more ferocious than something been.
On the federal level, yes. There's actually another bill that is has truth in the name, that people have kind of dubbed a CRT bill. And so that has become an issue on the federal level. Weirdly enough, in Michigan, and I was having a conversation with someone who wrote the policy around changing the curriculum in Michigan. They were able to get the curriculum, like in this last year, changed for Indian boarding schools, while there was like nothing, they wouldn't pass anything, right? Like they're like, so I don't know. That was strange, that didn't, because I feel like in many other cases, yeah, the CRT backlash will, carry over to the education of any marginalized group, most likely.
But Larry Brown, when he asked us, like,
Yeah.
storyteller, don't you think the trickster still exists on this planet?
Yeah.
Okay, that's why I was saying.
One way that I thought about this is, it's sort of I always feel like I have a secret, and the secret is that this country is so misinformed about Indigenous people that anytime, at least I talk about it in my classes or at events like this, people are generally sort of open and curious about it because most people forget to remember that Native people exist. And so it's not sort of welded in the same way to issues of race, particularly in this country, that Black folks in this country have to contend with because of this binary that's been created in the United States about white, Black, race. Like it's so focused on that I feel like Indigenous issues sort of get to skirt it sometimes in a way that feels really, that creates some space actually for like the talking about it and the listening about it, and in a way that doesn't feel quite as constraining. The other thing that I just sort of practice in my own work is I just don't use any of the buzzwords. I don't say decolonization. I don't say race. I don't say any of these things. I try to instead, my go-to is stories. Instead, I try to tell stories to like illuminate what it is I'm trying to engage people about in like a conversation. Something else we talk about in my class a lot is that Indian issues in this country are really interesting too, because even legally, they don't follow the dominant partisan rules oftentimes. Like we see Justice Gorsuch voting in favor heavily of tribal sovereignty consistently, when most of the time his sort of votes fall in a kind of predictable right-facing way. And then we see RBG annihilating tribal sovereignty on the bench her entire career. And so I use those two examples to just point out that Indian issues have always been very entangled and way more than this like very overly simplistic right, left, Republican, Democrat binary. And so that actually creates space for everybody to engage at a little bit deeper level than the limiting way that like a binary or one of two choices allows us to talk about anything. So I think that that
So I think that's helpful.
It's the start buying it, yeah. And that, Larry, that's why tricksters are post-stretch. That's why post-structuralism exists.
Someone like Robin Kimmer captures popular imagination because she's a storyteller, she's a scientist, she's indigenous. And then you may have somebody like Ortiz that's going to be very, 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 very critical. But what we have right now is a tremendous diversity of Native scholarship and Native articulation that is giving us also, I think, a field there. So you can negatively see our standpoint, speak against Ortiz or something like that. Then Kimber speaks and you're all going, oh yeah. But then there's this dramatic, powerful care for the ecology that is very radical, but it comes across in a story that allows participation. So I think my point is I think we have a great diversity opportunity right now.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, now I'm thinking about chewing on this question more. I think because Native people are political, like we're not a race per se, although we have been racialized in different ways, but we're political entities and political citizens of like nations that are considered to be nations by the federal government and are supposed to be spoken to on a nation to nation basis, that even while it's a domestic dependent sovereignty, that gives us more space. And because legally they have to care, and also because treaties are a two-way street. They have to uphold their end for our land to be considered a land that people can live on that aren't native, right? That's how a treaty works. And so I feel like, the United States allows for that political entity to get through. Yeah. Another question.
So my field is language education. And so I sort of have two questions here. Take either one and run with them. One is on language. So all three of you have talked so much about language as being both the locus of genocide within boarding schools, but also movements toward revitalization. So my question is why language? What's the significance or centrality of language in both sides of that? The other question is education. I keep thinking about, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? And how we don't have boarding schools in the same way that we used to, but we still have schools that, in my experience, working with Native youth are very damaging, painful, excruciating places, right? And I'm going to get back to the comment, like, what can we do, right? Like, this is happening in Columbia public schools. This is happening across the country in terms of curriculum, in terms of instructional methodologies, the other thing. Libraries, yeah, exactly. I mean, so my question is what's going on in education today or schooling today, or how might we think about that so either one of them, language or schooling in now, not as a past thing, but as a current ongoing thing within the context of structures that we're following.
There are okay, I'll start with the school one because I'm from Montana originally. I grew up going to public schools, and my mom worked at the Blackfeet Language Immersion School. So anytime that my parents brought us to that school, and so I knew about the Blackfeet Immersion School from a young age. It's now a language enhancement school because there are federal policies because of No Child Left Behind that there's English only testing. So it's actually really difficult to have full language immersion schools that are in native languages. But there are a number of alternative schools in Minneapolis. And I don't know if there are in other urban locations. I hadn't come across this before, but there are a bunch of alternative schools that are alternative high schools, that are language themed schools, but generally identity themed schools I've seen be very beneficial for kids. So there's like Dakota Prep schools, and that's just any of any sort. And I've spoken to the kids there, and they're going to be creating care packages for pool survivors with us. So, but they get to have like their culture be a part of their curriculum. Some of them went on a fast recently, like went on a fast for a couple of days with an elder. So there are people out there who are really creatively approaching education. And the tension that I think comes with that is figuring out if you want children to have opportunities around going to like PWIs, then it's going to be difficult for them to, with like certain educational formats. If you come from an indigenous school, they like a primarily white institution may not view that as an equal to another high school. So that's the challenge that I know people come to when it comes to high school students specifically. And then, yeah, sorry, then just shift real quick. The language like completely shapes our reality. And so my mom's an ethnobotanist, and I have learned a lot about the Black use of plants, and words explain how to use the plants, the words, they explain how to identify the plant. Words explain a lot of different relationships, our relationship to the natural world and the intangible world is explained through our languages. And there's just so many aspects of our culture that doesn't have a translation into English, which is why there's a lot of natives who have like 1 million cousins, and you're like, are those actually your like blood cousins? I'm like, what's going on? Because there's no, at least in Black, there's no translation for those second, third, fourth, fifth cousin. It just shapes your reality in its entirety. And I think that we can, if you think about English and the way that English genders things, the way that English structures our world, you can kind of imagine the way that other languages may structure a world. And also language in connection to land is really significant too, place names, the history of the land and the area. So if we lose those languages, we lose that relationship to land. We have to start all over. That's, I mean, that's the issue that we're dealing with right now is a lot of people try to start all over without any of that knowledge. Now we've got a bunch of issues. That's exciting.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a reason the federal government tried to get rid of indigenous languages. Like Iku said, the knowledges live in the languages. Like you can't know how to be Métis or Anishinaabe unless you speak those languages, because how to be those people with those knowledge systems, with those relationships to place and one another, you can't know that in English. It's literally impossible. And so I am not fluent in either of the indigenous languages that my family has carried in the past. But what I have had is in my own revitalization journey, even in learning words, just standalone words, I get access to cultural knowledge. I get access to a different kind of being in the world. I'll give just a concrete example to sort of anchor this. There's a word in Anishinaabe-Moan. The word is Indonako-Bichigan. So the translation for this, as close as English can make it, it's actually, it means great-grandchild and it means great-grandparent. Like there's no distinction between it. And the reason it's the same word is because it basically means what happens to my grandchild also happens to me, their great-grandparent. And so contained in Indonako-Bichigan is the understanding that from a great-grandparent to a great-grandchild is 7 generations of people that are affected by each other, no matter which direction you go. And so if there's an Anishinaabe-Moan linguist that I know, and he broke down the word to demonstrate like what each part of Indonako-Bichigan, how that explains how me as an Anishinaabe person ought to be in relationship to my great-grandchild potentially and my great-grandparents in the past. And so if I know that word, I know that I'm in relationship with those people all the time, and I will heal things, navigate things, make decisions based on that kind of knowledge. And so that's literally just one word that I would not know how to be in any way that someone could describe to me in English. But now that I have that word, I have a different understanding of myself as a result of it. And so I could go on, of course. Imagine having a whole language with that kind of access, like sort of mind blowing to think about.
Is there any way to entangle that? Because language is construction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is there any way to entangle English? Because the English don't own English anymore. French don't own French, right? This is a part of globalization. It's part of colonialism. So how can you take ideas and concepts like that and put them into a language to where the language now adapts to that concept of those ideas? I think that we can construct potentially meaning behind that. Even hybridizing a language that has indigenous words with English words, with French words, with Spanish.
That's what mentioned there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. Yeah.
I've also read River Métis on my little shelf side, but it's complicated, but we're all the same.
Yeah.
At least we are.
But it is going back to language as conceptual, building cosmologies, building relationships, as opposed to instrumental, functional kind of language. And that, but I, those kinds of, well, you have to be woke. Because that implies, oh yeah, it's a worldview there. It's relationships, it's a political action. And that's the kind of thing may happen, as Mark's suggesting, in that the hybridization may allow us.
But
Hey, or gonna change those standards, right? Educate those standards.
This is just maybe a comment or something, but wouldn't it be the case with the same Gaelic and the Irish compared to the actual English and Wales and all those actually Congo and all those identity of where you actually from, and especially the dialects within the differentiation and where you come from, and they're able to tell you part of the English right here. But it's been that always that fight for maintaining Gaelic as the actual way to eradicate the prospect of the original language when it comes down to tradition, religion, whatever that means, right? So wouldn't it be the same or the same concept for any other language?
Well, yeah, how about Gaelic and Cherokee, Gaelic in Muskogee Creek, Gaelic in Chickasaw?
Yeah.
So the Scots-Irish, that has a huge relevance to the state of Missouri and our history here, and how those people mixed decades before they came to western expansion. They were already trading. If you look at Macintosh and you look at John Ross, whose parents were in Scotland, they have a mixture of indigenous regalia, but tartan as well. Nothing wrong with that. There was no criticism. There was no critique. There was no, at that particular point, something happened in the 1900s. Something happened with modernism. Something happened the way we think, because it just was, right? And it is. And there's a book by that Harvard from Dartmouth. His name's Kavanaugh, I think is his last name. And he wrote this book called Highlanders, White People, and Indians. I think that's the name. But it talks about these types of things. He pulls historical evidence. Going into Cherokee villages, seeing these kids running around in tartan and speaking a blend of Cherokee and Gaelic.
Love this conversation. Is there any concern about sort of cultural mixing and cultural tradition? Is that a concern about language? My own cultural heritage is German, so everybody now knows Schadenfreude. We know this odd German word. But would there be an objection to using any of these?
I appropriate the hell out of everything. I go to France and I learn I go to Germany. I had a German exchange student that came in. We learned how to cook. I picked her brain. That's why I consider myself, first and foremost, more of a global citizen. That's why I see myself as a global citizen, because I like to appropriate these things, put them into my life. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a part of being. It's part of my identity, right? If everybody has an identity here, a global citizenry is also potential identity. Now, that whole appropriation thing goes deep, Larry. It goes deep, right? And we start to think about turning things into products, turning things, then we get back to capitalism. Dadgummit. If we go back to all that stuff, I'm just talking about simple. How do we problem? I don't know about you. Richard.
I mean, I would maybe call that, I think I like to participate in cultural exchanges.
I appropriate the hell.
I knew you were gonna say that.
So I think these are for more strict bond.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get to that, the language topic. So there's really no objections to non-native people learning native languages because it's a language, it's not proprietary. The proprietary information is usually found in ceremonies, stuff like that. So language isn't proprietary. What I do think is wrong that many white academics have done is to commodify and sell the language back to people that they took the language from. So basically it's weirdly common. It's weirdly common. Like if you go to NIEA, if you go to any of these conferences, the people who are selling language materials are not native people. So that's the part that I'm about. I'm totally fine if someone is fluent in Blackfeet. That would be very cool to have more people fluent in our native languages. But the selling of the native, I mean, I was also raised to believe that you shouldn't sell a language in general. But that's the part where
Well, and the selling of rituals, and spirituality.
Yeah.
Too, marketing that.
I mean, there's something too to be said for, I mean, I know Oklahoma universities there are teaching indigenous languages.
Mhm.
And there are universities in the Great Lakes regions that have Ojibwe classes, and there's sort of So there's sort of a structural issue, though, that Native people attend universities less than any other group of
Right.
people. And so if their languages, they live there to be learned, but Native people have a whole bunch of systemic barriers, then they'll be the last people to learn their languages. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of other people will get access to it. So I agree with you. I don't think it's like a negative thing. These languages, like, I want them to stay alive, no matter who's speaking them. And like, it is a problem if the last people who get access to them are the people who belong to the languages. So, yeah.
Well, Kiowa is you can take it as a foreign language at OU, foreign language. You can take it. And I asked my dad, who is a linguist, anthropologist at OU, retired now. Dad, how many Kiowas since 1993 have taken that course? Oh, 15. I said, how many students that are non-Kiowa? He said thousands. I said, so you're telling me that there are thousands of students who are non-Kiowa that know more about Kiowa than people in the community. I mean, you can either cry about that or you can find it hilarious and postmodern and whatever it is you want to talk about.
Trickster.
The trickster. What's more important? The survival of the language, who speaks.
Well, and this is really about, you can have a language that's just purely transactional, and then you can have language that's felt and cultural. And so I think having a language that's felt and cultural is much different than having transactional language.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just saying before, the resurrection of Hebrew is a good example of a cultural language that now is a live language that was a dead language, but brought back not just a language, but an entire cultural phenomena that goes along with the Jewish people, right? So I can imagine that a similar thing exists in the Native American community where you revitalize the language to bring these things that have no meaning. Just because you learn the language doesn't mean you understand that I have a connection across 7 generations. That's not the same thing.
Yeah.
I think it's 6, so, we'll end this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for great questions.